They say a family is built on a foundation of truth. But what happens when you discover that the very bedrock of your existence, the memories you've cherished for 2 decades, are built not on stone, but on sand? What happens when the tide you never saw coming finally rolls in and washes it all away? For David, a man who built his life on certainty and structure, the tide arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening, delivered not by a crashing wave, but by the silent glow of a computer screen. The house was peaceful, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of the dishwasher finishing its cycle. Outside, the suburban street was settling into its nightly rhythm, a predictable pattern of lights blinking on in neighboring windows. Everything was exactly as it should be. The email itself seemed harmless, its subject line clinical and mundane. Regarding policy update, genetic marker verification. It was just a formality, a final step in upgrading the family's life insurance, a task David had been meaning to complete for weeks. He clicked it open with the casual indifference of a man checking off a to-do list, expecting a simple confirmation, a digital nod of approval. He downloaded the attached file, a sterile-looking PDF from a certified lab. His eyes scanned past the logos and the fine print, searching for the simple match he knew would be there. But the word he found was not match. Staring back at him from the center of the page, in bold, unforgiving letters, were 2 words that shattered the stillness of his world. Paternity exclusion. The phrase didn't make sense. It was like reading a sentence in a language he had never seen before. He read it again, and then a 3rd time, the letters seeming to rearrange themselves, to mock him. The air in his lungs grew thin, the rich smell of coffee suddenly sickening. A strange, silent ringing began in his ears, blocking out the familiar sounds of his home. His gaze lifted from the screen, drifting across the living room to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. There, in a silver frame, was the photo he cherished most. A much younger David, beaming with a pride so profound it seemed to radiate from the picture, holding his newborn daughter, Sarah. Her tiny hand was wrapped around his finger, her eyes barely open. That single moment had defined him for 20 years. It was the anchor of his soul. Now, as he stared at the image, a cold dread crept up his spine, turning the anchor into a block of ice in his stomach. The man in the photo suddenly felt like a stranger, the baby in his arms a beautiful, perfect stranger. The foundation of his life didn't just crack, it dissolved into dust, revealing a terrifying, gaping void beneath. The last 20 years of his life, every birthday party, every scraped knee, every father-daughter dance, had all just become a lie. To understand the depth of the chasm that opened in David's life, you must first understand the world he had built, or rather, the world he believed he had built. He was an architect, not just by profession, but by nature. His mind found comfort in blueprints, in the logic of load-bearing walls, and the immutable truth of a level foundation. He designed sprawling, beautiful homes for the wealthy, structures of glass and stone that seemed to rise organically from the American landscape. But his greatest creation, his masterpiece, was the life he had constructed within the walls of his own home in the quiet, tree-lined town of Maple Creek. It was a life of elegant simplicity and profound certainty. His house, a classic colonial he had personally renovated, was a physical manifestation of his values. Every corner was perfectly joined, every floorboard solid underfoot. It was a fortress of domestic tranquility, a testament to order in a chaotic world. And at the heart of this fortress were the 2 people who gave it meaning: his wife, Emily, and their daughter, Sarah. Emily was the warmth to his structure, the art to his science. Where David saw lines and angles, she saw home. She was effortlessly charming, the kind of woman who could host a dinner party for 12 without ever seeming flustered, whose laughter was a melody that filled every room. She managed their lives with a quiet grace that David deeply admired. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who tended the vibrant garden in the backyard, who knew precisely how to soothe him after a stressful week. He saw their marriage as a perfect partnership, a synergistic union where his ambition was nurtured by her devotion, and her happiness was the ultimate goal of his hard work. They were a team, a single, indivisible unit against the world. He loved her, of course, but more than that, He trusted her. His trust in Emily was as foundational to his world as the concrete beneath his house. And then there was Sarah. Sarah was the reason for it all. She was the project of his heart, the legacy he was building. From the moment he first held her, a tiny, perfect bundle in the sterile light of a hospital room, he had felt a love so fierce and absolute it reshaped his entire being. He wasn't just David the architect anymore. He was Sarah's father. That title became his core identity. He was the one who taught her to ride a bike on their quiet street, his hand steady on the back of the seat until she finally wobbled away on her own, her triumphant laughter echoing back to him. He was the one who patiently sat with her for hours at the kitchen table, turning complex calculus problems into solvable puzzles. He saw his own logical mind reflected in her, sharpened by a brilliance that was all her own. Now 20, a pre-med student at a prestigious university, she was everything he could have ever hoped for. Their weekly calls were a ritual, a sacred point in his schedule where the demands of work faded away, and he could just listen to her talk about her classes, her friends, her dreams. The pride he felt was a constant, warm glow in his chest. His life was, by every conceivable measure, perfect. It was a life of comforting rituals. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, with David flipping them while Sarah, even as a teenager, would try to steal the chocolate chips. Summers meant 2 weeks at a rented cabin on a lake in Maine, the days spent swimming and the nights spent around a bonfire. Christmas Eve was their sacred family night, with the same classic movies and Emily's famous hot cocoa. They were the golden family of Maple Creek, the one others looked up to, a quiet benchmark of success and happiness. And watching over this perfect picture, often from a comfortable armchair in the corner of their living room, was Margaret, Emily's mother. Margaret was a formidable presence. A widow for over a decade, she was a woman carved from granite, always impeccably dressed, her opinions as sharp and precise as the diamonds she wore. On the surface, she was the doting grandmother and supportive mother-in-law. She showered Sarah with gifts, praised David's success, and spoke often of how proud she was of the life Emily had built. David respected her, as one was supposed to respect their mother-in-law, but he had always felt a subtle, unnerving friction in her presence. Her compliments sometimes felt like evaluations. Her advice often sounded like a directive. There was a watchfulness in her eyes, a constant assessment that made him feel as though he were a character in a play she was directing. She was fiercely protective of Emily and the family's reputation, often speaking of the importance of maintaining appearances. David had occasionally found it overbearing, this constant emphasis on perception, but he dismissed it as the anxieties of an older generation. He saw her as a pillar of their family, another solid support beam in the structure he so admired. He didn't see her as the keeper of the keys, the guardian of a secret so corrosive it had been silently eating away at the foundations of his world for 20 years. He saw only the facade, the beautiful, flawless exterior, because that is what he wanted to see. As an architect, he knew that the most critical part of any building is the one you cannot see, the foundation buried deep in the earth. But in the architecture of his own life, he never thought to look. He never imagined that the ground beneath his feet was anything but solid rock. He believed in his blueprints, in the life he had designed and built with his own 2 hands, for his own perfect family. He had no idea he was living in a house of cards, and a single gust of wind was about to bring it all down. The catalyst for the collapse was not a moment of suspicion, it was a moment of ambition, Sarah's ambition. The seed of doubt was not planted by a lie, but by a request for a simple truth. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in October, during their weekly video call. David was in his home office, the clean lines of his desk, and the faint smell of architectural paper, a familiar comfort. On his screen, Sarah's face was bright with excitement. Her dorm room, a chaotic backdrop of textbooks and posters. She was telling him about an opportunity, a highly competitive summer research fellowship at a renowned medical institute. It was a program focused on genetic therapies, a perfect stepping stone for her pre-med track. David leaned forward, his heart swelling with the familiar paternal pride. She was so much like him, always striving, always building towards the next goal. He listened intently as she detailed the program's prestige, the professors she would work with, the incredible experience it would be. He was already mentally composing a celebratory email to the family. Then she got to the application requirements. "It's pretty intense," she said, her voice a mix of awe and anxiety. Besides the essays and transcripts, they want a full medical workup, including a comprehensive genetic profile. They want to see family predispositions, blood compatibility markers, the whole 9 yards. They even said it's a great way for us applicants to engage with the material on a personal level. To David's logical mind, this made perfect sense. It was practical, data-driven. "That's fantastic, honey," he said, a broad smile on his face. "A chance to learn about your own blueprint. We can finally settle the debate over who gave you your stubbornness." He was about to make another joke when Emily appeared at the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She had been in the kitchen, half listening, and walked in, her face beaming with pride for their daughter. "A fellowship? Oh, Sarah, that's wonderful news," she said, setting a mug on David's desk and leaning towards the screen to get a better look at their daughter. "Tell me everything." Sarah quickly recapped the details, her excitement infectious. But when she mentioned the genetic profile again, a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. It was almost imperceptible, like a fractional drop in temperature. David didn't notice it, but it was there. Emily's smile remained, but it became fixed, a beautiful mask that no longer quite reached her eyes. "A genetic test?" she said, her tone just a little too casual. "That seems invasive. Are you sure you're comfortable with that, sweetie? Giving a company all that private information?" Sarah, used to her mother's protective nature, laughed it off. "It's totally secure, Mom. It's a medical institute, not one of those ancestry websites. Besides, it's a requirement. It's non-negotiable." David nodded in agreement, taking a sip of his coffee. "She's right, Em. It's just procedure. Think of it as another form to fill out. We've got nothing to hide." The words left his mouth with an easy, unthinking confidence. He looked at Emily, expecting a nod of agreement, but instead, he saw a flicker of something strange in her expression. It was a brief, unguarded look of panic. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a look of maternal concern. "I just don't like it," she insisted, her voice a little tighter now. "It feels so clinical, reducing our family history to a lab report. Why can't you just provide our medical records? We've always been healthy." Her resistance was beginning to feel disproportionate to the request. It was just a simple test. David put his hand on her arm reassuringly. "Honey, it's not a big deal. It's a simple saliva kit they send to the house. We spit in a tube, we send it back. It'll take 10 minutes. It's for Sarah's future. We'd do anything for that, right?" He said it as a statement of fact, a core principle of their lives. For a moment, Emily didn't answer. She looked from David's trusting face to Sarah's expectant one on the screen. The silence stretched for a beat too long. She seemed to be searching for another argument, another way out. Finally, she forced a small laugh and squeezed his hand. "Of course," she said, her voice strained. "Anything for Sarah. You're right. It's just silly, I suppose. Just being an overprotective mom." The conversation moved on. They talked about Sarah's upcoming midterms, about plans for Thanksgiving break. The tension dissipated, and the call ended with the usual chorus of "I love yous." But after he closed his laptop, David looked at his wife. She had her back to him, rinsing the coffee mugs in the kitchen sink with a meticulous, focused energy. Her shoulders were rigid. He watched her for a moment, a tiny, fleeting question mark appearing in his mind. Her reaction had been odd. Emily was private, yes, but this felt different. It was a visceral opposition, an anxiety that seemed to have no logical source. But then he dismissed it. It was, as she said, just a mother's worry. It was her nature to be cautious. He was the architect, the planner. She was the guardian, the worrier. That was their balance. He walked into the kitchen, wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, and kissed her on the neck. "It'll be fine," he murmured. She leaned back against him, but he couldn't see the look on her face. He didn't feel the tremor of fear that ran through her. He didn't know that in that moment, he was holding a woman who had just realized that the carefully constructed world she had built around her lie was about to be hit by a wrecking ball. The seed had been planted, and in the rich, fertile soil of 20 years of deception, it would not take long to grow. The silence that followed David's discovery was a living thing. It filled the spaces between the ticking of the clock on the wall and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. The house, his fortress of tranquility, had become a tomb, and he was its sole, ghostly occupant. For a long time, he just sat there, the glow of the screen painting his face in a cold, artificial light. The two words, paternity exclusion, had burned themselves onto his retina. He didn't feel anger, not yet. The shock was too profound, a seismic event so deep that the initial tremor had simply turned his entire emotional landscape to dust. He was numb, hollowed out. With a slowness that felt alien to him, he stood up. His movements were precise, robotic. He walked to the printer in his office, the quiet whir of the machine an obscene intrusion into the suffocating silence. He printed the single page, the lab report, and felt its flimsy weight in his hand. It felt impossibly light for something that carried the mass of a 20-year lie. Emily was in the living room, curled on the sofa with a book, bathed in the warm light of a reading lamp. She looked up as he entered the adjacent kitchen, a soft, welcoming smile on her face. "Long day?" she asked. Her voice the familiar melody he had loved for more than 2 decades. He didn't answer. He walked to the gleaming white marble of the kitchen island, a surface they had picked out together, a symbol of their clean, modern life. He placed the paper face up in the center of the island. He didn't slide it. He didn't toss it. He placed it with the deliberate care of a man laying a single wreath on a grave. Then he waited. Her smile faltered at his silence. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "David? What is it? You're scaring me." She put her book down and walked towards him, her brow furrowed with concern. She glanced at the paper, her expression one of simple curiosity. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up. He watched her as she read it. He watched the exact moment the words registered. It wasn't a gasp. It was a subtle, sharp intake of breath. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of porcelain. A small, nervous laugh escaped her lips, a brittle, unnatural sound. "Well, this island. Weird," she stammered, looking up at him, her eyes wide and searching. They must have made a mistake. Mixed up the samples at the lab. "You hear about that happening, right?" Her voice was rising, gathering a frantic, desperate momentum. She was trying to build a new reality, a plausible explanation to patch the gaping hole that had just been torn in their own. "We should sue them. Honestly, the incompetence, causing people this kind of stress." She looked at him, pleading with her eyes for him to agree, to join her in this fiction. But David's face was a mask of stone. His silence was her true accuser. He didn't need to speak. The absence of his denial, of his immediate agreement, was a confession in itself. Finally, he spoke. His voice was unnervingly calm, a low, flat tone that held none of their shared history. It was the voice of a stranger. "Is it a mistake, Emily?" The question, so simple, so quiet, landed in the space between them with the force of a physical blow. It offered no accusation, no rage, but it stripped away all of her defenses. Her frantic energy faltered. "What? Of course it's a mistake. David, look at me." She took a step towards him, her hand outstretched. "This is us, 20 years. Sarah is our daughter, our perfect girl. How could you even let a piece of paper make you question that?" He took a single, deliberate step back. It was a small movement, but it was a rejection so total, so final, that she flinched as if he had struck her. Her hand fell to her side. That was the moment her facade finally shattered. The desperate hope in her eyes died, replaced by the flat, dead look of resignation. The carefully constructed dam of 2 decades burst, and the truth, a toxic, stagnant thing, began to spill out. The paper slipped from her nerveless fingers, fluttering back onto the cold marble. The first tear fell, then another, tracking silent paths down her pale cheeks. There were no loud, heaving sobs. It was the weeping of absolute defeat, "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "David, I am so sorry." He said nothing. He just stood there, his stillness, a terrifying judgment. He had become an architect watching a controlled demolition, observing the collapse of his own masterpiece with a cold, detached clarity. "It was so long ago," she choked out, the story coming in broken fragments, pieces of a past he never knew existed. "Before we were married, that week you moved out, when we were fighting, I was so lost, so alone. I was stupid. I never, ever meant for it to happen. I promise." The confession hung in the air, a poisonous vapor, tainting every memory he held dear. Every anniversary, every family photo, every loving glance was now a lie. He felt a strange dislocation, as if he were floating above the scene, watching two strangers in a brightly lit kitchen as their world ended. The anger hadn't come yet. The grief was still a distant storm on the horizon. In its place was just a vast, echoing emptiness, a cold, clean void where 20 years of love and trust had once resided. The woman crying in front of him was not his wife. He didn't know who she was. And the most terrifying part was the single, unanswered question that now began to form in the silence of his mind. If he wasn't Sarah's father, who was? The silence in the kitchen was a vacuum, pulling all the air from David's lungs. His wife's whispered apology, her fragmented confession of a long-ago mistake, meant nothing. It was just noise, static, obscuring the one piece of information that now mattered. He had been erased from the most fundamental equation of his own life. The numbness that had cocooned him was beginning to recede, giving way to a cold, sharp-edged clarity. He was an architect surveying a ruin, and he needed to know the name of the demolition crew. His voice, when he finally found it, was steady, betraying none of the chaos raging within him. "Who, Emily?" The question was quiet, but it was not a request. It was a demand for the final, missing piece of the blueprint of his destruction. Emily flinched, wrapping her arms around herself, as if a cold wind had just swept through the room. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Her gaze was fixed on the pristine floor tiles, as if the answer were written there. "Please, David," she pleaded, her voice thick with tears. "Don't make me. It doesn't matter now. It won't change anything." "It changes everything," he countered, his voice dropping even lower, gaining an edge of steel that made her shudder. Who was he? He saw the internal battle on her face, the terror of speaking the name warring with the futility of hiding it any longer. She shook her head, a silent, desperate no, but his gaze was relentless. He would stand there all night. He would stand there for an eternity until she gave him the name. Finally, her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. She took a ragged breath, and the name came out as a barely audible whisper, a ghost of a sound. Mark. For a moment, David's mind refused to process it. Mark. The name was familiar, of course, but it belonged in another context, in another part of his memory. It belonged to his brother, his younger, charming, reckless, and long-dead brother. The name couldn't possibly belong here, in this kitchen, in this conversation. It was a categorical error, a file placed in the wrong cabinet. But then he saw the look on Emily's face, the devastating certainty in her shame-filled eyes, and his mind was forced to make the connection. Mark. A wave of nausea so profound washed over him that he had to grip the edge of the marble island to keep from falling. The white-hot pain that shot through him was nothing like he'd ever experienced. It was a betrayal that echoed backwards in time, desecrating even his grief. It was his wife and his brother, his dead brother. The brother he had mourned for 19 years. The brother he had eulogized, whose memory he had protected, whose photograph sat on his desk. Suddenly, a montage of memories flashed through his mind, now twisted and grotesque. Mark, laughing as he pushed a young Sarah on a swing. Mark, ruffling his own hair, with a smile that was so similar to Sarah's. Mark, his best man at their wedding, standing beside him, knowing this secret. The past was no longer a safe place. It was a crime scene, and David had been the only one who hadn't known it. With the name finally spoken, Emily's story came tumbling out, a desperate, pathetic attempt to explain the unthinkable. It was that week, she whispered, her eyes still on the floor. 21 years ago. That awful fight we had when you said you needed space. You went to stay with your parents. I was here, alone. I thought we were over. She explained that Mark had come over. Not with intent, she swore, but as the concerned brother, the peacemaker. He was worried about her, worried about David. He'd brought a bottle of wine. They talked for hours. She cried. He comforted her. The house was quiet, their loneliness a shared space. It just happened, she said. The words a pitifully inadequate description of an act that had defined all of their futures. It was one night, David. A single, stupid, drunken mistake. We both regretted it the second it was over. We swore we would never speak of it again. A few days later, she and David had reconciled, their reunion passionate and full of promises. The fight was forgotten, a mere blip in their great love story. But weeks later, when the pregnancy test came back positive, a cold dread filled her. She counted the days. She knew. The child wasn't his. I panicked, she confessed. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. The first person I told was my mother. And there it was. The other name, Margaret. The formidable, watchful matriarch, the quiet director of their lives. As Emily recounted the conversation, David could picture it perfectly. A terrified Emily, confessing her secret to her steely-eyed mother. Margaret hadn't offered comfort or moral guidance. She had immediately seen the situation for what it was, a crisis to be managed. My mother. She told me I had a choice, Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. She said Mark was a good man, but he was impulsive, still trying to find his way. You, David, you were stable. You were kind. You were building a future. She said telling the truth would destroy everyone. It would destroy you. It would destroy Mark's relationship with you. It would shame me for life. She said the most important person to protect was the baby. Emily's voice took on a distant, reciting quality, as if she were channeling her mother's words from 2 decades ago. We will bury this, she told me. You will be a wonderful mother, and David will be a wonderful father. This child will have the perfect life. That is more important than a truth that will only cause pain. She made it sound logical, like an act of mercy. And so, the conspiracy was born. A pact of silence between mother and daughter. They would build a perfect life for David on a foundation of his own ignorance. And when Mark died in a car crash just a year and a half later, the secret was cemented. The only other person in the world who could have exposed the lie was gone. As he listened, David felt the last vestiges of his old world burn away. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a premeditated act of deception, a cold, calculated conspiracy that had spanned his entire adult life. Emily hadn't just cheated on him. She and her mother had stolen his life. They had cast him in the lead role of a play without ever giving him the script. The woman he loved and the woman he had respected as a mother were his jailers. The grief for his lost brother was now hopelessly entangled with a burning, bottomless rage. He was utterly, completely alone, a ghost in the ruins of a life that had never truly been his. The confession did not end with a cleansing storm of anger. There was no shouting, no shattered plates, no catharsis. It ended with a silence more profound and terrible than any noise. After Emily's story had dwindled into ragged sobs, David turned without a word and walked away. He left her weeping in the brightly lit kitchen, a ruin amidst the pristine surfaces of their perfect life. He retreated to his office, the one room in the house that was exclusively his, a sanctuary of order and logic. He closed the door, and the sound of the latch, clicking into place, felt like the ceiling of a tomb. He did not turn on the lights. He sat in his leather chair in the darkness, the faint moonlight drawing sterile silver lines across his blueprints and architectural models. But the familiar logic of his profession offered no comfort now. His mind, once a finely tuned instrument for understanding structure, had turned against him, and it was deconstructing his own life, memory by painful memory. The past was no longer a fixed point of reference. It had become a fluid, treacherous landscape, and every cherished memory was now a landmark in a vast territory of deceit. He remembered the day Sarah was born. He remembered the weight of her in his arms, a startling, miraculous weight. He remembered looking at Emily, her face tired but radiant, and feeling a love so complete it felt like the final, perfect keystone locking his life into place. Now, he replayed that scene with a new, horrifying filter. He saw Emily's radiant smile not as joy, but as the triumphant relief of a gambler who had just won an impossible bet. He saw Margaret, standing by the hospital bed, her expression not one of grandmotherly delight, but of a chess master surveying a board where her risky gambit had paid off. And he saw himself, the beaming, ignorant fool, the centerpiece of their grand illusion. He was a prop, a necessary, beloved, but ultimately deceived prop. The memories kept coming, unbidden and cruel. Sarah, age 5, falling from her bicycle, the sharp cry of Daddy, as she looked for him, and only him. He remembered the feel of her small body clinging to him, her tears soaking his shirt, and the fierce, primal surge of paternal love he felt. My daughter needs me. But was she his? The love was real, he knew that. His love was the only thing in this entire mess that felt true, but the context was a lie. He was the designated father, the man playing the role, while the ghost of his brother, the true biological father, stood unseen in the wings. He thought of his brother, Mark. The grief he had carried for 19 years had been a clean, noble thing. It was the honorable pain of a brother's love cut short. Now, that grief was putrid, infected with betrayal. He tried to remember his last conversations with Mark, searching for a clue, a hint, a flicker of guilt in his brother's eyes. He remembered Mark clapping him on the back a few months before he died. "You hit the jackpot, Davy," Mark had said, a wide, easy grin on his face. "Emily's incredible. And that little girl, she adores you. You're a lucky man." At the time, it was a simple, heartfelt compliment. Now, the words dripped with a sickening, ironic poison. Was it pity in his brother's eyes? Was it a secret mockery? Or was it, perhaps, a genuine, guilt-ridden acknowledgement of the lie? He would never know. The ambiguity was a special kind of torture, leaving him to shadowbox with a ghost. Days bled into one another. He moved through his own house like a phantom. He stopped going to the office. Calls from his business partner went to voicemail. He ate nothing. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were a feverish replay of happy memories, now nightmarish and distorted. The house he had so lovingly designed and renovated became a museum of lies. Every photograph on the wall was a monument to his foolishness. The hand-drawn height chart for Sarah, penciled inside the pantry door, felt like a forgery. Emily tried to reach him. She would leave food outside his office door. She would speak to him in soft, pleading tones. "David, please. We need to talk about this. Don't shut me out." He would look at her, or rather, through her. There was no hatred in his eyes, no anger. There was nothing. It was the blank, indifferent stare one would give a complete stranger. His silence was his only weapon, and it was devastating. It was a wall of absolute nullification. In it, he was erasing her, erasing their 20 years, erasing the entire fraudulent structure of their life together. He had been an architect, a man who prided himself on seeing the flaw in any design, on understanding the importance of a solid foundation. And he had spent 2 decades living in the most fundamentally flawed structure imaginable and had never once suspected. The professional pride he once had was now a source of deep, burning shame. He wasn't just a victim, he was a fool. His identity had been built on a single, central pillar. He was Sarah's father. It informed everything he did, every choice he made. Now that pillar was gone, and he was left wondering what, if anything, remained. Was he just a custodian? A benefactor? A 20-year-long act of charity? Late one night, he found himself standing before the fireplace, staring at the family portrait taken just last year. David, Emily, Sarah. 3 smiling people, the very picture of happiness. He looked at Sarah's eyes, searching for a trace of Mark. He looked at Emily's smile, searching for the lie behind it. And he looked at his own face, at the happy, oblivious man staring back at him. He felt a profound and chilling detachment from that man. That man was dead. He had died in a quiet moment, sitting in a dark room, staring at a computer screen. The man who was left was someone else entirely, someone colder, quieter, someone who now understood that the world was not built on logic and clean lines, but on secrets and lies. And as he stood there in the ruins of his life, a new feeling began to coalesce in the cold, empty space of his heart. It was not grief, it was not rage. It was a calm, chilling resolve. The unraveling was over. It was time to start building something new. The period of deep, paralytic grief lasted for 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, David was a ghost in his own home, a silent observer of the wreckage of his life. But his mind, the mind of an architect, cannot tolerate a vacuum for long. It is designed to build, and if it cannot build, it must at least analyze the collapse. On the 22nd day after the revelation, something inside him shifted. The crushing weight of the pain did not disappear, but it began to change its form. Grief, when compressed by a profound sense of injustice, does not simply fade, it crystallizes. It becomes something harder, sharper, and infinitely more durable. It becomes purpose. He sat in his darkened office late one night, and for the first time, he considered his next move not as a victim, but as a strategist. The obvious path was tempting. A storm of rage. He could confront them, scream the decades of his stolen life back into their faces. He could pack Emily's bags and throw them onto the manicured lawn for all of Maple Creek to see. He could call a family meeting and detonate the secret like a bomb, reveling in the chaos and the shrapnel. But as he played these scenarios out in his mind, he felt nothing but a cold disdain. A screaming match was their arena. Emily would cry, Margaret would rationalize, and the entire event would devolve into the messy, emotional theater they were experts at directing. He would be just another hysterical, wronged husband, a pathetic figure in a cheap melodrama. They would feed on that drama. His pain would become their power. No, that was not justice. Justice, he decided, had to be structural. It had to be as quiet, as methodical, and as devastatingly precise as the lie they had constructed. If they were the authors of a 20-year fiction, he would be the editor who meticulously, dispassionately redacted their entire world. His revenge would not be a fiery explosion. It would be a quiet, systematic demolition. His new project began that night. He wasn't searching for evidence of the affair. The truth of that was a wound that no longer needed probing. He was searching for the evidence of the life they had built on that lie. He turned on his computer, the screen illuminating a face that was now leaner, colder, and harder than it was a month ago. He opened the files he had not been able to look at for years, their shared financials. For hours, he worked with the chilling focus of an auditor. He downloaded 2 decades of bank statements, investment reports, and credit card bills. He imported the data into spreadsheets, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was no longer looking at numbers, he was looking at a story. And the story it told was one of a staggering, casual entitlement. He saw the endless charges at high-end boutiques for Emily, the tuition for the private art classes she took but never finished, the substantial donations to charities that secured her a prominent place on their boards, a position of social power funded entirely by him. He saw the pattern of Margaret's involvement, the frequent 5-figure loans from their joint account, always vaguely justified as a bridge for an investment or a minor emergency, but never repaid. He saw the first-class flights, the luxury spa weekends, the country club membership. It wasn't a crime. It was simply the comfortable, luxuriant lifestyle of 2 women who had built their nest in the heart of his life's work, never once considering the foundation might be fraudulent. He printed every statement, every receipt, creating a dense, damning portfolio of their dependency. This was not about the money itself. It was about what it represented, the material manifestation of the lie. The next morning, he began his search for a lawyer. He ignored the familiar names in Maple Creek, the attorneys who belonged to his country club. He looked downtown, in the city, for a name that connoted not friendly mediation, but surgical precision. He found her on the 34th floor of a glass and steel skyscraper. Evelyn Reed, a senior partner at a firm that specialized in high-net-worth divorces. Her reputation was that of a shark who swam in the iciest of waters. When David walked into her office, he did not look like her typical client. He was not red-faced and trembling with rage, nor was he pale and broken. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his demeanor calm, his eyes holding a disconcerting intensity. He sat opposite Miss Reed at her vast glass desk and did not waste time on pleasantries. "My wife has been unfaithful," he began, his voice even. "That is not my primary concern. My primary concern is a 20-year fraud that has formed the basis of my entire marriage." He proceeded to lay out the facts, the DNA test, the confession, his brother, his mother-in-law's role, with the dispassionate clarity of an engineer describing a catastrophic structural failure. He spoke without emotion, which made the story itself all the more horrific. He then pushed a thick, neatly organized binder across the desk. "This," he said, "is the financial history of that fraud." Miss Reed, a woman who had seen the ugliest side of human relationships for 30 years, was silent for a full minute after he finished. She looked from the binder to the man in front of her. She was used to clients who wanted blood. David wanted something far more chilling. He wanted deconstruction. "What is your desired outcome, Mr. Collins?" she finally asked. "I want a clean amputation," David said, his voice like ice. "I want to set up an irrevocable trust for my daughter's education and future, firewalled from any influence from her mother or grandmother. As for my wife and her mother, I want to sever every financial tie. I want to dismantle the life they have been living at my expense. I don't want to destroy them, Miss Reed. I simply want to return them to a state of financial reality. Their reality, not mine." In the weeks that followed, David continued to play the part of the silent, grieving husband at home. His withdrawal was the perfect cover. Emily and Margaret, misinterpreting his silence as deep depression, began to treat him with a careful, placating tenderness, believing that with time he could be managed, perhaps even coaxed into a new, broken kind of normal. They had no idea that from his locked office he was waging a silent, devastating war. On the phone with his financial advisors, he methodically redirected funds. He closed joint accounts, citing administrative reasons. He liquidated shared assets and moved the capital into new holdings under his sole ownership. Each transaction was legal, precise, and utterly invisible to them. With every quiet phone call, every email, every signature, he was pulling a thread from the tapestry of their lives, and soon there would be nothing left. He was no longer the victim in the house of cards. He was the architect of its fall. The silent war in the Collins household waged on for 2 months, a cold, quiet conflict fought in the spaces between words, in averted glances, and in the unnerving stillness of a man who had retreated so far into himself he was barely there. To Emily and Margaret, David's withdrawal was a troubling but manageable phase. They treated his silence like a long illness, something to be weathered with patience and careful handling. They believed that underneath the grief, the man they knew, the practical, stable, family-oriented David, was still there, and that eventually he would choose the path of least resistance. He would choose to preserve the beautiful, comfortable life they all shared. They were, of course, catastrophically wrong. The opportunity for them to misread the situation so completely came in the form of a milestone: Margaret's 70th birthday. It was Emily who proposed the idea, her voice tentative, testing the waters of his silence. "Mother's birthday is next month," she said one evening, finding him staring out the window of the darkened living room. "Her 70th, I was thinking. Maybe we should throw her a party. A proper one. To celebrate her." She expected him to ignore her, or to respond with a flat, dismissive no. His silence had been his answer to everything for weeks. But to her utter astonishment, he turned from the window, his expression unreadable in the dim light, and answered. "Yes," he said, his voice even. "I think we should." Emily was so surprised she could barely hide it. "Really? A 70th birthday is a significant event," he continued, as if discussing a logistical problem. "It would be wrong not to acknowledge it properly. She deserves a celebration." He even suggested a venue. "We should host it at the club, in the main ballroom. Do it right." Emily was flooded with a wave of dizzying relief. It was more than she could have possibly hoped for. A party at the Maple Creek Country Club was not just a celebration. It was a statement. It was a public declaration of unity, of status, of normalcy. Later that night, she relayed the conversation to her mother over the phone, her voice brimming with renewed hope. "I think he's coming back to us, Mother," she whispered. "He wants to do the party. He's choosing to move on." On the other end of the line, Margaret's voice was laced with triumphant satisfaction. "Of course he is," she said. "David is an intelligent man. He's an architect. He understands the importance of a strong facade. He knows that a scandal would destroy everything he's worked for. He's choosing to protect his investment. He's choosing us." And so, the two women, with a renewed sense of security, threw themselves into planning the grandest party the country club had seen in years. It was their masterpiece of denial, a meticulously crafted illusion of a happy, thriving family. They spent weeks deliberating over floral arrangements, debating the merits of a string quartet versus a jazz trio, and curating a guest list that included everyone who mattered in their carefully stratified social world. This party was to be the ultimate performance, proof to everyone, and most importantly to themselves, that the foundation of their lives was still secure. Throughout the entire process, David was a model of serene compliance. He became their silent partner, their ghost producer. He sat with them at the dining room table as they reviewed catering menus, offering no opinions, only quiet assent. When they presented him with the astronomical budget, he glanced at the bottom line and simply said, "Whatever you think is appropriate," signing the check with a hand that was unnervingly steady. His performance was flawless. He was the very picture of a devoted, if subdued, husband and son-in-law. His placid agreement was so complete that it should have been terrifying, but Emily and Margaret were too high on the narcotic of their own wishful thinking to see it. They saw what they wanted to see: a man broken by grief, who had finally accepted his fate and was ready to resume his role. There were moments, small fissures in his performance, that might have warned them. One afternoon, while discussing the seating chart, Emily reached across the table and placed her hand on his, her touch a hopeful, tentative gesture. "Thank you for this, David," she said softly. "It means more than you know." He did not pull his hand away. He simply left it there, beneath hers, a cold and lifeless object, offering no pressure, no warmth in return. He looked at her, his eyes as empty and placid as a frozen lake, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The moment passed. Another time, Margaret was excitedly describing the 5-tiered cake she had chosen. "It will be a magnificent centerpiece, won't it, David?" she asked, fishing for his approval. He looked at her, a faint, polite smile touching his lips. "It sounds perfect, Margaret. It will be a night everyone remembers." The words held a chilling double meaning that was lost entirely on them. They were so busy constructing the stage for their triumphant return to social grace that they never once realized they were also building their own scaffold. The producer of this grand play, the man silently funding their fantasy, was also the executioner. The night of the party arrived. The ballroom at the country club was a glittering spectacle of crystal chandeliers, cascading white orchids, and the soft glow of 100 candles. The air hummed with the murmur of polite conversation and the elegant strains of a string quartet. Margaret was radiant in a silk gown, the matriarch holding court, accepting compliments and congratulations from a stream of wealthy, well-dressed guests. Emily was at her side, a perfect hostess, her smile bright, her laughter easy. She felt a genuine, intoxicating happiness for the first time in months. They had done it. They had weathered the storm. And there was David, standing dutifully by her side, impeccable in his tuxedo. He greeted guests with a firm handshake and a quiet, dignified smile. He was the image of the successful, supportive husband. But if one were to look closely, truly closely, they would see that his smile never reached his eyes. His eyes were constantly scanning the room, not with social grace, but with the cool, patient assessment of a predator. He was counting his audience. He was checking the lighting. He was waiting for his cue. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here, dressed in black tie, holding a glass of champagne, and calmly waiting for the perfect moment to make landfall. The grand ballroom of the Maple Creek Country Club was a symphony of success. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, vibrated with the sound of clinking champagne flutes and the self-satisfied murmur of the local elite. Margaret sat at the head table, a queen upon her throne, radiant under the soft glow of the crystal chandeliers. She accepted the endless stream of compliments with a regal grace, her eyes sweeping the room with the look of a general surveying a victorious battlefield. Emily, seated beside David, was luminous with relief. Her hand rested on his arm, a gesture of casual ownership she hadn't dared to make in months. The crisis had passed. The family facade was not only intact, it was stronger and more brilliant than ever. David played his part to perfection, a portrait of dignified composure. He was a pillar of quiet strength, the dutiful son-in-law, the supportive husband. After the main course had been cleared, a family friend and the evening's master of ceremonies, a portly man named Arthur, tapped a spoon against his glass. The room gradually fell silent. "Friends, family," Arthur boomed, his voice full of practiced warmth. "It is my distinct honor to celebrate the 70th birthday of a true pillar of our community, Margaret. And who better to lead us in a toast than the man who is not only her son-in-law, but a true son to her in every sense of the word. Ladies and gentlemen, David Collins." A wave of warm, genuine applause filled the ballroom. All eyes turned to David. Emily squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with pride and gratitude. This was it. This was the moment of public reconciliation, the speech that would cement their victory and bury the ugly truth forever. David carefully placed his linen napkin on the table. He gave Emily a brief, unreadable glance, then stood. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet as he walked to the podium at the center of the dance floor. He adjusted the microphone, his hands perfectly steady. The room was hushed, a sea of expectant faces turned towards him. He looked out at them, at his business partners, at the neighbors they'd hosted for countless barbecues, at the faces of the people who formed the very fabric of their public life. He saw his lawyer, Miss Reed, seated at a table near the back, an oasis of calm professionalism in the warm, social sea. Finally, his gaze settled on the head table, on the two women who were smiling at him, waiting for the loving tribute to begin. "Good evening," he began, his voice clear and resonant, filling the silent room. "We are here tonight to celebrate a milestone, 70 years, an age that commands respect. And we are here to celebrate a woman who, above all else, has always valued the importance of family." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Margaret has always taught us about the importance of a strong foundation, in life, in a home, and in a family. She has a remarkable talent for architecture herself, you see, the architecture of relationships. She has an instinct for knowing which pieces fit where, which truths should be used as load-bearing walls, holding everything up for the world to see." He paused again, his eyes locking with Margaret's. "And which truths are best buried deep in the concrete of the foundation, never to see the light of day." A few people shifted uncomfortably. The metaphor was slightly odd, but Margaret's smile only widened, taking it as a strangely poetic compliment. Emily beamed. David's tone then shifted. The warmth vanished, replaced by a chilling, factual coolness. "For 20 years, I lived inside the magnificent house this family built. I admired its structure. I trusted its walls. I believed, with every fiber of my being, in the integrity of its foundation." He let the silence stretch, drawing every ounce of attention in the room towards him. The murmuring stopped completely. "I discovered recently, however, that my place in that home was predicated on a fatal design flaw. My entire life within that structure was built upon a lie of omission that was conceived 21 years ago and has been meticulously, flawlessly maintained ever since." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Smiles froze and faded. A wave of confusion and alarm washed over the guests. At the head table, Emily's face went pale, her hand flying to her throat. Margaret's regal poise stiffened, her eyes narrowing with a sudden, dawning horror. They knew exactly where this was going. "And so," David continued, his voice as cold and sharp as breaking glass, in the spirit of building a new life, on a new foundation based on actual, verifiable truth. I feel it is the perfect occasion to make 2 announcements. He held up one finger. First, as of this morning, I have officially filed for divorce from my wife, Emily. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Emily made a small, choked sound, her eyes wide with disbelief and terror. David held up a second finger, ignoring the chaos he had just unleashed. Second, the reason for the divorce is simple. A recent, scientifically verified DNA test has confirmed that I am not the biological father of Sarah, the wonderful young woman I have had the privilege of raising and loving as my own for the last 20 years. The room descended into a state of absolute, stunned silence. You could hear nothing but the hum of the air conditioning. Every guest was a statue, their faces a mask of shock. David then turned his head slowly, deliberately, and aimed his final, devastating volley directly at the guest of honor. The biological father was my late brother, Mark. He let that sink in. And the person who knew this from the very beginning, the woman who counseled her daughter to build a life on this lie, the brilliant architect who designed this 2-decade deception in order to protect the family from an inconvenient truth, is the very woman we are here to honor tonight. He raised his champagne flute in a mock toast. Happy birthday, Margaret. He reached down beside the podium and picked up the thin, black leather folder he had placed there earlier. I realize these are shocking allegations, he said to the petrified crowd. And words alone are not proof. He didn't open the folder. He simply held it up. Fortunately, all the relevant documents, the lab report, the financial statements detailing the life that was funded by this lie, are all in here. And my lawyer happens to be here to witness this statement. He scanned the crowd. Evelyn, if you wouldn't mind. As if on cue, Miss Evelyn Reed stood. In her elegant evening gown, she looked like any other guest. She walked calmly to the podium, took the folder from David's outstretched hand, gave a slight, professional nod, and walked back to her seat. That single, quiet action was the guillotine. It transformed David's shocking speech from a hysterical outburst into a cold, verified, legal fact. The public trial was over. The verdict was in. David looked out at the ruins of the evening, at the shattered faces of his friends and the 2 women who had destroyed his life. His work was done. Thank you for your attention, he said into the microphone, his voice now utterly devoid of any emotion. He looked toward the 5-tiered birthday cake, a magnificent, untouched monument to a lie. Please, enjoy the cake. And with that, he stepped away from the podium, turned his back on his old life, and walked calmly, deliberately, towards the ballroom doors, leaving behind a devastation more complete than any storm. For a long moment after the ballroom doors swung shut behind David, no one moved. The silence he left in his wake was absolute, a perfect vacuum where the music, the laughter, and the polite chatter had been only minutes before. It was as if he had detonated a bomb that destroyed only sound. The 150 guests sat frozen, their faces a gallery of disbelief. The string quartet, mid-note, had faltered into a discordant silence. All eyes were fixed on the head table, where Emily and Margaret sat as if flash-frozen, 2 pale statues in a tableau of ruin. Then the spell broke, not with a shout, but with a single, nervous cough from the back of the room. It was the signal. A man pushed his chair back, the scrape of its legs against the polished floor sounding like a gunshot. He murmured something to his wife, and they rose, their movements furtive, their eyes fixed on the exit. Another couple followed, then a whole table. The exodus was not a stampede. It was a quiet, deeply awkward dissolution. No one said goodbye. No one offered a word of comfort or condolence to the guest of honor. They simply fled, scurrying away from the wreckage, their faces averted as if shame were a communicable disease. Within 10 minutes, the grand ballroom was nearly empty, a cavern of glittering devastation. The magnificent 5-tiered cake, a monument to a life that no longer existed, stood untouched. The army of waiters, unsure of what to do, began to clear away the full plates of food and half-empty glasses of champagne, their movements a quiet, professional counterpoint to the emotional carnage. The public humiliation was immediate and total, but it was only the first wave of the consequences. The story of Margaret's 70th birthday party became the stuff of Maple Creek legend overnight. It ripped through the town's social fabric with the speed and ferocity of a plague. By morning, there wasn't a person at the country club, the salon, or the organic market who hadn't heard a detailed, embellished account of David Collins's devastating speech. The perfect family's implosion was a far more delicious topic of gossip than any charity gala or golf tournament. For Emily and Margaret, the fallout was a social death. The world they had so carefully cultivated, the world that was the entire basis of their identity, simply ceased to exist. The phone in their large, silent house stopped ringing. The invitations that had once filled their mailbox stopped arriving. When Emily, in a desperate act of denial, called her supposed best friend to talk, the call went to voicemail, and the message was never returned. One afternoon, Margaret walked into her preferred upscale grocery store, and the aisle fell silent, the conversations dying as she passed, the stares of the other shoppers like tiny, sharp needles on her skin. Their power had been built on a currency of perception and influence, and David's speech had declared them bankrupt. 2 weeks after the party, a letter arrived by courier. It was from the law offices of Evelyn Reed. It was not a plea, not an accusation, but a cold, clear, legal document outlining the new reality. David's terms were as precise and unyielding as his speech. The house, which was legally his, was to be put on the market immediately. They were given 90 days to vacate. Their joint credit cards had been canceled. Their country club membership, tied to David's name, was terminated. He would, the letter stated, provide a one-time spousal support payment to Emily, an amount that was legally compliant but brutally insufficient to sustain the life she knew. The most cutting part of the document, however, concerned Sarah. A separate section detailed the creation of the Sarah Collins Educational and Life Trust, an ironclad, multi-million-dollar fund that David had established. It would pay for her remaining tuition, her graduate school, a down payment on a home, and provide her with a generous annual stipend. The message was clear and devastating. David's love and responsibility for the daughter he had raised remained absolute. His financial and emotional connection to the two women who had deceived him was severed completely. He was protecting the child of the lie and expelling the architects of it. The weight of these consequences finally crushed the united front that mother and daughter had maintained for 2 decades. They were in the cavernous living room, surrounded by packing boxes, the ghosts of their former lives taped up and labeled. Emily, who had been placid and dependent her entire life, was finally animated by a sliver of pure rage. "This was your masterpiece, Mother," she spat, her voice dripping with a venom Margaret had never heard from her. "Protect the family. It's for the good of the child. Those were your words. Look at us now. You didn't protect us. You coached me into building a prison, and we've just been handed a life sentence." Margaret's formidable composure, her greatest weapon, had rusted into a brittle, defensive fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, her face contorted with a bitterness that made her look truly old for the first time. "I spent 20 years keeping your pathetic secret. I built this life for you. A life you were too weak and foolish to have secured for yourself. You made the mistake. I managed the fallout. This failure is yours, not mine." In the ugly, echoing space of that argument, the final illusion died. Their bond was not one of love, but of mutual codependency in service of a lie. It was a business partnership, and now that their sole investor had pulled out, they were turning on each other. The fall was as swift as it was brutal. They left the sprawling colonial for a small, rented townhouse in a neighboring town where no one knew their name. The elegant furniture was sold to pay for deposits. Margaret, the revered matriarch of Maple Creek society, was now just an old woman watching television in a cramped, beige living room. Emily, the charming hostess and philanthropist, now stood in a grocery store aisle, comparing the prices of generic brands. The power they had wielded was never theirs. It had been a reflection, a borrowed light from the man they had kept in the dark. Now that he had stepped away, they cast no shadow at all. They were left with nothing but the long, quiet, unremarkable years ahead and the suffocating company of each other. The demolition was complete. In the cold, quiet aftermath of the demolition, after the dust had settled and the onlookers had departed, David was left with one final, terrifying piece of reconstruction. The justice he had exacted upon Emily and Margaret was a calculated, necessary act, but it had come with a high price, and the bill was paid in part by the one person he had never wanted to hurt, Sarah. His relationship with her was the last remaining structure in the wasteland of his life, and it was fragile, damaged by the shockwave of his actions. He knew that if he didn't try to salvage it, his victory would be meaningless. He called her a week after the party. Her voice on the phone was small, a ghost of her usual vibrant energy. He didn't ask her to come to the sterile corporate apartment he now called home, nor did he suggest her dorm room. He chose a neutral space, a quiet, forgotten coffee shop in a town halfway between them, a place with no history, no memories to corrupt. When she walked in, his heart broke. The confident, bright-eyed young woman he knew was gone, replaced by a girl who looked lost and exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she moved with a heavy, weary uncertainty. She sat opposite him in the booth, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea, and didn't meet his gaze. The silence between them was thick with pain and confusion. David knew he had to be the architect of this conversation, and the foundation had to be the one truth that remained. He leaned forward, his voice low and gentle. "Sarah," he began, "look at me, please." She slowly raised her eyes, and he saw they were full of tears. "The first thing you need to hear, and the most important thing I will ever tell you, is that none of this is your fault," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the innocent party in all of this, the only innocent one. Do you understand me?" She gave a small, uncertain nod. "The second thing," he continued, "is that my love for you has never been a lie. It is the realest thing I have ever felt. The pride, the joy, the worry, all of it. From the moment I first held you until this very second, sitting in this booth, that is real. Biology does not get to change that. Nothing changes that." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a tiny crack in the wall of her pain. He had to keep going, carefully, brick by brick. He told her the story, not of the party, but of the discovery. He explained the shock, the feeling of his world dissolving. He was honest about the depth of the deception, about her mother's choices and her grandmother's role in orchestrating the lie. He didn't do it to poison her against them, but to give her the terrible gift of the truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice a raw whisper. "Why, Dad? Why did you have to do it like that? At the party? In front of everyone?" Her use of the word dad was a knife in his heart. "You didn't just hurt them. You humiliated me. The whole campus is talking about it. I can't even walk to class without people whispering." The pain of her words was immense, but he met it with honesty. "I know," he said softly, "and for the shame this has brought on you, I am truly, deeply sorry. You were collateral damage in a war you had no part in, and that is my great regret. But I need you to understand. Their power, their entire world, was built on a public image. The lie wasn't just in our house. It was at that country club, at those charity events, in every conversation they had with those people. To destroy the lie, I had to do it in the place where it lived and breathed. It was a cancer, Sarah, and it required a radical, painful surgery. I had to cut it out, all of it, so that something true could have a chance to grow." "What's true anymore?" she cried, the tears now flowing freely. "My whole life, our family. Was it all fake?" "No," he said, his voice firm. "Don't ever believe that. When you were 6 and terrified of the thunderstorm and you fell asleep in my arms, that was real. When you were 16 and I taught you how to drive and you almost took out Mrs. Henderson's mailbox, our laughter was real. Your graduation, your acceptance into college. My pride was real. The love was real, Sarah. The premise was the only lie." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "This all happened because of me. Because of that stupid application. If I hadn't asked for that test." "Stop," he said, his tone gentle but absolute. Do not for 1 second take the blame for this. The lie was there for 20 years, like a fault line under our house. Your test didn't create the earthquake, it just recorded it. The truth was going to come out eventually. You didn't cause this disaster, Sarah. You ended the lie. You gave me the truth. And as painful as it is, that is a gift. He let her cry, let her process the impossible weight of it all. He knew he couldn't ask her to choose a side. She was caught between the father who had raised her and the mother who had birthed her. It was an unbearable position. The family we were, he said finally, his voice heavy with sadness. That family is gone. It was a beautiful picture, but the frame was built on a lie, and it has fallen apart. We can't fix it. But you and I, we can build something new. It won't be the same. It will be fractured and complicated, but it can be honest. It can be real. He reached into his pocket and placed a new key on the table. This is for my apartment. You are welcome anytime. No questions asked. No pressure. I'm not going anywhere. I am still your father, in every way that counts. That is a permanent, non-negotiable fact. He stood to leave, knowing that she needed space more than anything else. I love you, he said. When you're ready, I'll be here. He walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her there with the key and the ruins of her childhood. The future between them was a question mark, a fragile, uncertain thing. But the conversation had been a foundation. The justice he had sought was not just an act of destruction, but an act of creation, the creation of a space where a new, truer relationship with his daughter could one day be built. It was a fractured future, but for the first time, it was an honest one. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, and the raw, gaping wound in David's life began the slow, painful process of scarring over. The divorce was finalized, a quiet, administrative end to a loud, dramatic tragedy. The house in Maple Creek, a place so saturated with ghosts and lies that he could no longer breathe within its walls, was sold. On a cold, gray afternoon, David found himself there one last time, walking through the empty, echoing rooms for a final inspection, before handing over the keys to a new family who would, he hoped, build happier memories there. In the garage, amidst the last of the clutter to be cleared, he saw it, a dusty, forgotten cardboard box pushed under a workbench. On the side, in his own faded handwriting from 2 decades ago, were 2 words, Mark's stuff. It was a time capsule of his brother's life, filled with things David couldn't bear to part with after the accident. Old college yearbooks, a worn leather jacket, a baseball glove. He smiled sadly, the memories now tinged with a complex, bittersweet pain. At the very bottom of the box, beneath a stack of faded vinyl records, was a large manila envelope he had never seen before. It was sealed. His name was not on it. With a flicker of curiosity, he tore it open. Inside was a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. He recognized the elegant, looping script instantly. It was Emily's, and the replies, written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl, were unmistakably Mark's. He sat down on the cold concrete floor of the empty garage, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of afternoon light from the window, and began to read. The letters were dated 21 years ago, from the terrifying weeks after their one night together. The first was from Emily, a letter full of the frantic, youthful panic of a girl whose life was about to be irrevocably changed. She told Mark she was pregnant, that she had done the math, that she knew the child was his. What do we do? She had pleaded on the page. David will be destroyed. Our families will be destroyed. I will be destroyed. It was Mark's reply that made the world stop. The letter began, I have something to tell you, Em. Something I haven't even told David yet. He wrote that he had been feeling unwell for months and that he had finally gotten the diagnosis, an aggressive, inoperable cancer. The doctors had given him less than a year. The breezy, carefree tone of his brother that David remembered was gone, replaced by the raw, terrified voice of a young man staring into the abyss of his own mortality. Then came the plea. Don't tell him, Mark had written, the words pressing so hard into the page they were nearly torn through. Please, for the love of God, do not tell him the truth. I am a dead man walking, What kind of a father can I be? I can't give this child anything, but David can give her everything. He can teach her to ride a bike. He can watch her graduate. He can be there to walk her down the aisle. He's a better man than I am, Em. He's solid. He's good. The final lines were a dying man's last wish, a desperate, selfish, and profoundly loving bargain. Let him be her father. Let him have that joy. Let my daughter have a life with a real father. It's the only good thing I can leave behind. Swear to me you will never tell him. David read the letters twice, then a third time, the flimsy paper trembling in his hands. The sharp, clean narrative of his life of betrayal, justice, and revenge had just been shattered into 1,000 complicated, tragic pieces. The story was not what he thought it was. Emily's lie, the lie he had so clinically and brutally punished, was not born simply of her own selfish fear. It had been a pact, a terrible, misguided secret kept for a dying man. Her weakness did not excuse the 2 decades of deceit that followed, nor did it forgive her mother's cold, pragmatic manipulation. But it recast the entire tragedy in a new, heartbreaking light. He saw her now not as a monster, but as a terrified young woman trapped between an impossible truth and a dying man's final wish. His white-hot rage towards her, the rage that had fueled him for months, finally cooled, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of a profound and weary sadness. And his brother, the ghost he had been shadowboxing with, was not the carefree betrayer he had imagined. He was a tragic figure, a boy forced to become a man in the face of death, who made a desperate choice to secure his child's future at the cost of his brother's truth. The betrayal was still real, but it was now hopelessly entangled with an act of flawed, desperate love. He walked out of the empty garage and closed the door on his old life for the last time. As he drove away, he reflected on the nature of his own justice. It had been perfect, a flawless architectural demolition of a fraudulent life. It had delivered consequences. It had brought the truth to light. But the letters had revealed a story far more complex and human than his binary code of right and wrong could ever account for. He had sought the truth, and he had found it. But it was a truth riddled with pain, grief, and a love so tangled it was indistinguishable from a wound. And in that moment, David understood. Justice isn't always about victory or punishment. Sometimes it is just the quiet, lonely acceptance of a truth too painful and complicated to ever be made simple. The silence he had worn as armor for months was no longer a weapon. It had become something else entirely. A space to heal, a space to grieve for everyone involved, a space to understand. Because in the end, you should never underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too much. For in that silence, he isn't just healing, he is understanding. Thank you for joining us for this story. Tune in next time for another journey into the heart of family drama.